Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Merci d'être là à nos rendez-vous du mardi 5 à 7 et aujourd'hui nous sommes le 18 mai. L'événement que nous allons suivre ensemble est la suite d'un événement qui a déjà eu lieu le 4 mai dernier et qui avait déjà été organisé par messieurs Gérald et Philippe Page. Je tiens déjà à les remercier pour l'organisation de cet après-midi. C'est un plaisir pour le CLUSIS de les retrouver aujourd'hui et surtout de les retrouver en très bonne compagnie. Et vous allez le voir dans les minutes qui suivent. Donc, sans plus tarder, pour pouvoir entrer directement dans le vif du sujet, j'en profite déjà pour remercier encore nos sponsors pour leur confiance et leur soutien. Je donne directement la parole à Monsieur Gérald Page qui va lui directement vous présenter les interlocuteurs et surtout les intervenants d'aujourd'hui. Bonne conférence, à tout à l'heure. Merci pour votre présence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We switch to English, if I understand. Just a quick introduction. For the ones who've been here with us on May 4th, on May 4th we quickly talked about very important issues like the control over data to protect certain values, economic values, and who should or could own that data legally. We talked about re-establishing control using a concept of decentralization and authentication. And we discussed what the possible consequences, which means responsibilities or even liabilities to share between private people, companies, and even the state. And we concluded that, and this is again today, one side of the issue of data governance, we concluded that data governance should be established by companies or society at large before we go into implementing systems and networks. Now, between the 4th of May and today, some of us might have seen in Le Temps, I think at the end of last week, French translation of the original article of Professor Zuboff of Harvard in the New York Times, which is basically a short summary of her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. So just me as a short introduction, I won't speak about it. I just quote one of the things she writes in this article. I mean, she's been studying for about over 30 years the process of going into this totally connected, digital, intelligent information society. And she writes in particular, and I quote her here, on the strength of their surveillance capabilities and for the sake of their surveillance profits, the new empires engineered a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup marked by unprecedented concentration of knowledge about us and the unaccountable power that accrues to such knowledge. Then she continues, in an information civilization, societies are defined by questions of knowledge, how it is distributed, the authority that governs its distribution, and the power that protects that authority. Who knows? Who decides? Who knows? Who decides? Who decides? Who knows? Surveillance capitalists now hold the answers to each question, though we never elected them to govern. They claim the authority to decide who knows by asserting ownership rights over our personal information and defend that authority with the power to control critical information systems and infrastructure. This is the background we're having, so we are talking about real societal and serious business. And today, we want to go further in our discussions. We have experts on this panel who will help us show what can be or what could be alternative concepts allowing to regain the control over personal data, as well as a panel discussion following this showing practical implementation and specific examples for tomorrow, meaning today, the immediate tomorrow, which is 2025, and even going further after tomorrow, 2030. And we have a distinguished panel with, I think we'll start with Mr. André Kudra. André Kudra is a veteran of digital identity. He's the Chief Information Officer of esatus AG, and member of the board of the German IT security association Teletrust. He has been among the pioneers in bringing advanced decentralized identity solutions to enterprises, and he's extremely active in the digital identity projects in Germany as well as in Europe, with his recent launch of ESIC, the European Self-Sovereign Identity Consortium. He's going to tell us about a few things, quite a few things about self-sovereign identity, even in a way which lawyers can, I think, understand. Then we will listen to Paul-Olivier Dehaye. Paul-Olivier is a very active actor in the privacy area, but he's also a real actor, because you've probably seen him pictured on Netflix in the Cambridge Analytica, The Great Hack. He's the one who understands actually within the algorithm behind the pictures we see and what we don't understand mathematically and technically. So I think he's among us the one able to understand this, and he will talk to us about some concepts of data sharing. He's known also as a successful defense for Uber driver in London. He's a board member of My Data, which is an award-winning international non-profit privacy organization. We will also have on the panel Massimo Marelli, who he's a distinguished lawyer. He is the head of an extremely large and efficient team as the head of the Data Protection Office of the ICRC, the International Committee for Red Cross. He's teaching himself data protection. He's an active member producing a lot of material for the Brussels Privacy Hub, and has published quite a few articles and interventions in this area. And after these interventions, there will be short presentations followed by a few questions. We will have a panel discussion. Philippe, you met him also last time, but he will introduce the panel discussion with a short presentation, very short presentation. And Philippe is the early bird in this area of digitalization. I mean, he was at the CERN in 1983, but Tim Berners-Lee was just in the cellar. But he moved up to certain floors. And Philip has lived this time, and then has seen what happened within companies, large financial institutions, with the flow and the gathering of information. He's now a consultant, and he has founded, as we've heard before, the Human Colossus, which is a foundation which is deemed to implement some new paradigms in interaction on the web. So I'll just give the word now to André Kudra. We'll start with him, unless Olivier, are you ready to go, or?
I'm just as ready as we can be.
Well, let's follow the proper order of the agenda, and we'll start with you, Olivier.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for these problems. My slides, as you will see, were not meant to be played through an intermediary, even if it's Philippe. So today I'll try my best. Thank you, Philippe. So today I'll talk about autonomy and meaning through data collectives. Next slide, please. I'll give you a bunch of examples that will be, and there will be a commonality in all of them, that I will highlight the loss of meaning and the loss of autonomy that is experienced by the individuals I'll talk about. And both losses are amplified by the notions of scale, but it's really important to understand that this loss of autonomy and this loss of meaning, those two separate losses actually feed into each other. Next slide, please. So imagine you have an individual, a friendly woman, who shares information with friends, and she talks to her friends, and those friends talk to each other in her back. Then those friends have information about her, and she's not quite sure what information they have. They will have separate information, and they will have exchanged information about her without her knowing. Then she might feel trapped in a certain way. She had the ability of presenting her life, presenting herself to each of those two friends separately. And now there is a back channel of communication between those two friends, and she feels kind of trapped in relation to them because she's not able to shape the way she presents herself with respect to them separately. Next slide, please. So imagine now that the same woman is browsing online and she's interacting with different websites, websites A and B or services A and B. Now those sites in her back, next slide, please, will, well, first of all, she will exchange cookies with each of them. And then in her back, those different sites will exchange the cookies between them and they'll start accumulating a profile about her. Then she will be very uncertain what information is held, what meaning they are building about her, what information they are accumulating, what value they attribute to that. And she will feel trapped in relation to that. She will lose a sense, an ability to present herself differently in different places on the web. She will lose some of her autonomy because she will not be able to make sense of how they themselves are making sense of her. So now let's consider another example, this time coming from biology. And maybe here, Philippe, go for the next slide and pause a little bit. So I'll talk about a cell, but I picked the example of a cell because we've all had biology courses. So it's quite easy for us to think about one cell and many cells, to think about the evolution of a group of cells and to anthropomorphize, in a sense, a cell. We can think of ourselves as constituted of many cells, but in the current pandemic, we can also think of a virus instead of a cell, a virus sitting inside of many cells. We can also think about humans trying to trace the virus, or the virus evolving and becoming new variants that will try to attack us in different ways or attack populations in different ways. So I will not talk about all of those different variants, ways of thinking about it, but they're very rich. And I encourage you to think about them afterwards if you would like. So now back to this example with this cell. The cell interacts with its environment. So next slide, please. We'll have a lot of interactions with A and B, and over time will evolve so that its interactions with A and B are beneficial to the cell or to the lineage of cells. Now, what if A and B start to be coupled in ways that the cell does not know, right? A and B's actions are shaped by some external effort. Maybe humans are shaping the way a forest is, and then there is a specific mushroom in that forest. And so the mushroom is interacting with trees, but suddenly humans might make a different decision about the trees. And so what happens is that there are relations between A and B that the cell does not prepare for, does not evolve mutations to prepare against. And so this cell starts to become very dependent on A and B's relation being structured in a certain way. And if it suddenly changes, then the cell will be completely inadapted and will have lost some of its ability to evolve, some of its autonomy, and that will represent danger for the cell. This can actually be formalized, and I put a link at the bottom there, or a reference at the bottom, to these actual papers that talk about this notion of autonomy for a cell, if you want. And the way the cell is collecting meaningful information about its environment, that it's encoding in its own DNA to enable the cell to survive with respect to the outside world. So now I jumped from an example that was about cookies, right, about life online. Then I jumped to an example that was about biology. Let's mix the two together. Right, so let's look at this example. Let's look at humans reproducing via platforms, via Tinder. Let's caricature a little bit, but here is Judith Duportail, a French woman, who uses Tinder and who interacts with many different men on Tinder. She has the option of assigning grades to those men. She might swipe left or right, and the platform would understand this to indicate a preference. Now, at first, she's using the platform in a bunch of one-to-one relationships, right? That's the way it's pictured to her. She's interacting with each of them separately or not. She's making a choice for each of them. But the platform, of course, encourages the men to do the same thing, to also swipe left or right, to indicate a preference or not. But most importantly, the platform starts aggregating this information about those different preferences that she expresses or that the men express about her into one profile, a profile for the men, but also a profile for her, of her own preferences or of her own score or the way men evaluate her. And that can also become problematic for her, because the platform will start to of meaning about her, to assign to her a grade. Maybe the platform will do an average of the scores she has received, and then she will be graded a 5 out of 10 by the platform. And the platform will use that information to decide what further profiles to show to Judith or not. So in a sense, now Judith is locked into this score that she has received. That becomes a label that she's assigned, and she doesn't even know it. She can't make sense of what the platform has done. She has no meaningful information about what the platform has done, but it has consequences with regards to the opportunities she does or does not have. Next slide, please. So, by the way, Judith is a real person. She's a journalist, Judith Duportail, and she has written a book about love under the algorithm. I slightly modified the jacket with my very extensive Photoshop skills by pasting her picture on the cover. I highly recommend that book. Now let's pick another example, and we can scroll a little bit faster through them, even faster. So this is about the news disinformation. I go about on Facebook and I interact with many pages. Facebook learns about that, and Facebook progressively builds a profile, but that profile I have no access to, and it ends up shaping the information I see. So I can build any meaningful information about what Facebook has built about me, how it makes decisions, but it has accumulated information about me that will start restricting my choices, restricting my autonomy to act in a world of information. Now, maybe the most concrete example of this happening is Uber. So this is Brahim Ben Ali. He's an Uber driver in France. He's also sort of a leader of a labor union 2.0. Brahim, when he works, when he drives his cab or his car for hire, interacts with many clients. Those clients give him stars, positive or negative stars. And of course, Uber collects way more data about him and about other drivers. And the consequence is that Uber is capable, out of all these one-to-one interactions, because it's sitting as a platform, it's able to build a coherent picture, or trying to build a coherent picture of how Brahim behaves as a driver, and potentially where he could be exploited, where this knowledge, this asymmetry of information could be exploited about him. And potentially, Brahim becomes really trapped. I mean, he, of course, represents all drivers in this picture, but he could really literally become trapped in the platform. There are cases where drivers are encouraged to make an investment, to buy a van, for instance, to drive, or a very highly luxurious car, to operate on the higher tiers of the platform, more expensive ones. And after a while, they might get good business at first, but after a while, they don't get any business anymore. But they have the very expensive car that they have to pay for. So they have to still drive for Uber, but they make less and less money over time. So that's a way that a platform can actually restrict the autonomy of those drivers, the opportunity to earn money in this case. So what kind of data does Uber collect? Well, here is an example of some data points collected over London for a driver that is working on the platform. So these are just points, GPS points. Actually, they are pickup and drop-off points, I think, in this case. The next slide, please. These are more GPS traces with the coloring indicating the speed. So this is the amount of, this just shows you a sense of the data they collect, the granularity. And this data is used to police the way drivers drive, the quality of their driving. Next slide. A little bit more detail about this granularity. Yes, again. And the next slide shows GPS traces of an event, a very special event, an event where a driver got assaulted by a client. So the driver got out of the car and started figuring out what to do. And these are examples of, well, these are the GPS coordinates that were collected during that relatively short event. Next. So when you see that much data, when you understand this asymmetry of information, you have to ask yourself, what is actually an abuse of this data? Maybe it's used to police the platform to prevent aggressions. That might be a very positive thing. Maybe this data translates into economic power. Maybe it translates into coercive power. You have to ask yourself, if I was in that position, if I was on the other side of this veil of this barrier, would I abuse that power? These are really important questions nowadays. Next. So again, what is common to all of these examples is a loss of meaning feeding into a loss of autonomy, and a loss of autonomy feeding into a loss of meaning, because it restricts the ways you can acquire information about what's going on about you. And scale feeds into both of those aspects. Next. So to recap quickly, this was the example with cookies. There was another example, the next one with Tinder. Yet the next one is with Facebook and disinformation. Then we have Uber. In all of those examples, next slide, we have someone interacting with a very complex system with information flowing all around. So what should we do about that? Next slide. We should try to make sense of what goes on here. We should really try to make sense of what all those data flows are. We should make sense of how they are making sense of us. And the only way to do this is to do it together. By comparison between, I think there's someone with microphone on still. So this is the only way we can make sense of this is by comparing our own situation to other people who are in a similar position, but there will always be interesting differences. Next slide, please. So that's really the proposal that we're really pushing in reality. These data collectives should enable us to recover and redefine meaning, so to regain autonomy over our own online lives. And with HestiaLabs, so the project that I lead, we're a small group working on this project. We're looking at those data collectives in each of those themes. So disinformation, Uber drivers, mobility, and dating apps. Maître Page mentioned the article by Shoshana Zuboff, where she talks about who decides who knows. We think that what is important here is who decides, who knows, who knows. So we want to know what they know about us. We think this is really important in order to build a collective and understand and build a strategy to counter the current situation. I want to really thank Philippe for sliding through quickly like this and being such a good sport. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul-Olivier. That's a very great insights. I don't know if our audience has questions. I had quite a few when listening to you, but anybody in the audience who wants to start with a question, let's have a few minutes of questions and then we'll go on to the next speaker. If there's no one, I have an immediate one, because you mentioned Professor Zuboff. One of the things she says is if you look at these Facebook or Tinder or Uber as a car, she says basically what is missing and that we need to produce is the possibility to lift the hood of the engine, the algorithms being the engine with the data inside, and look into that engine, because this is what we cannot do today. You've probably yourself experienced trying to what the law allows you to do. I mean, have access to your data. These companies give you very quickly. Facebook, we've done the exercise. I mean, answers you within almost 24 hours, giving you all your data. But actually, what you don't see is what's in the hood of the car. Do you have any experience with that?
Yes, a lot of experience. Actually, some of the data you get because I requested it in the first place, challenged them, pushed them really hard, and eventually they changed their systems globally for 1 billion plus people. So you don't get everything. That's definitely true, but you do get a lot now. You do get quite a bit of information. For instance, if you go to, I don't know, just about any politician's website and you're tracked by a Facebook pixel, now Facebook will tell you that you were tracked on that website by a Facebook pixel. If you use a CFF SBB app, they make big announcements that this data, they don't share any data with Google. And then if you look really deeply, they don't share any personal data with Google. But if you go into Google's interfaces where they disclose information about what they know about you, they'll say that you use the CFF app at this precise moment, even if you're on. So there is clearly exchanges of information, but the reality is that most Swiss companies don't know, and the platforms go so far into the transparency that they will sort of snitch on what the first layer, the first companies you actually interact with in the first place, what they actually do with this data, which is to transfer it to the platforms. So this transparency is very powerful, but it could be much more powerful if there was, one, a coherent effort between many actors to make this more transparent. And that's part of what we want to do with HestiaLabs. And by the way, if you think this is important, talk to us, because we want to do it with other people. So that's the first step, to build a collective effort, to build sort of a movement there. And the second is to theorize what is the most meaningful information to get about their profiling. So it's not just about getting all the data. That means very little. There is some information that's really critical. Let me give you an example. Uber drivers, I mentioned sort of, they buy an expensive car and then they get trapped. What the Uber drivers would like to know very much is whether the assignment of rides depends on them, depends on their performance. Uber says no, but it depends on their position, and there is some batching, but it doesn't really depend on like some long-term history with the platform. That's what Uber claims. But it also sort of implies that it depends on the car, right? So it doesn't depend on the driver, but it depends on the car. What I suspect is that it depends on whether the car is owned or rented by the driver, because that increases the dependency of the driver on the platform. If the driver rents or owns the car, if he has a loan, if he rents it from a partner of Uber, these are all different situations for Uber, and they might give a preference to some versus others. So that's a very crucial bit of information, because all of those drivers are not an homogeneous bunch. They are different in different situations. And that would be something where they really want to know, and they themselves really want to know. So a concerted effort to get that information would be very impactful.
Thank you. I don't know whether it is my system, but I don't see any questions on the chat. Philip, is that normal, or is it just for me? Because I just, if there are no questions from just one more, just to sum up, Paul-Olivier, if you're talking about Uber, I mean, the people go to Uber to become drivers because they think they have the freedom to create their own business. They have some, in your view, very generally, in just a few words, after all you said, do you think it's more freedom or less freedom for them? Some people have called them autonomous slaves.
Yes, it's very much the same as the discussion you actually hear about being addicted to social media. I've had drivers within 5 minutes, they talk simultaneously about, I'm not a taxi driver. I'm an independent. I'm my own business. And they also talk about being addicted to making money. It's behaving somehow a bit like a bandit manchot, like a jackpot machine, right? So they get a ride, and then 10 minutes later they get another one. They get a small offer, they refuse it, but suddenly they'll get a long ride from Geneva to all the way to Bern Canton or something, and they'll be very happy. And so it's really addictive. They describe it as addictive. So addictive that they spend, 16 hours a day in their cab waiting for a ride.
Okay, I just see one question in the chat. They say Uber is subject to the European legislation, like the GDPR. In your view, in your experience, do they generally respect that or not? I mean, it's hard to tell.
Well, it's getting clearer and clearer. So the situation now, it's recognized that Uber Netherlands is responsible because that's the headquarters in Europe. And now some drivers have gone to the Netherlands to challenge Uber on the fact that Uber was not answering their questions. And we had a first judgment at a lower court that actually was partly right and partly wrong. So very importantly, they recognized the right to drivers to unionize, in a sense, around their data, to build some kind of data unions and to use their rights that were originally thought as individual to collectivize those rights towards other goals. Very important aspect. But they also ask the drivers to specify explicitly what data they want and for what purpose, in a sense, which the GDPR doesn't quite require. And of course, Uber is putting like huge obstacles to them. But what I think they need, and this is part of what I'm trying to do with HestiaLabs, is people with technical expertise to break down the problems for them and to make sure that they ask the questions in the right way. So we definitely want to do that with Uber drivers in Geneva. We definitely want to push those ideas. And by the way, if you go to our blog, HestiaLabs.org, we have a Dutch expert talking about the judgment. You know, the judgment was in Dutch originally, but talking about this judgment and making and exploring all of those questions, essentially. I'll post a link in the chat.
Thank you, Paul-Olivier. I mean, we probably might get back in the panel on certain of these issues, since we're talking about autonomy, which is extremely central, because that's the basis of freedom, which is behind all this legislation. Now, maybe for the time is running, so I just give, without transition, the word to André, who will go deep into the SSI business.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about smaller pieces of data now, which is what self-sovereign identity is at its current state about. I will share my screen. Give me 1 second. So you should be able to see the presentation screen now. And despite my first name being in French, I unfortunately don't speak the language, at least not to an extent that I would be able to hold this presentation. So please excuse me for staying in English. But I would like to give you a little bit of a briefing into self-sovereign identity. And this is kind of a very new model of digital identity. And this is a very timely and lively topic, as we have basically communities throughout the world who are dealing with this contemporary topic today. This is the only slide that stayed in German. So my company is called esatus AG. I'm one of the board members and co-owners, and we are dedicated to information security. And since 2015, we are in the space of self-sovereign identity, first in lots of writing and conference presentations, and since 2 years also with technology in that space that we have developed and are offering to our clients, and ever-growing interest in the community. So we are strong in the area of identity and access. This is where we're basically coming from, doing identity and access projects in regulated environments, doing a lot of governance, risk and compliance work as well, data protection. Basically when GDPR came live, we did lots of work there, IT security in general, and we have a very strong team of software developers who are basically making all this self-sovereign identity work happen. And we are very active in the ecosystem. We are one of the founding members and steering members of Trust over IP Foundation, which has its goal to get a trust framework into the network world, so get the missing trust layer in the network world. We are one of the sovereign stewards, and I'm also a board member of the Sovereign Foundation, which is one of the largest self-sovereign identity networks and the pioneer in that space. And ID Union, we will cover a bit in my talk. And we are also a proud member of MyData, and we have been awarded as a MyData operator for the solutions that we bring in the self-sovereign identity space. And as I was announced as a Teletrust board member as well, so Teletrust is the German IT Security Association, and you may like the fact that Clüsis and Teletrust share the same year of birth, so both were basically started in 1989. So we have just 2 years ago celebrated the 30th anniversary. So maybe there is also some room for further cooperation beyond this talk here. And so basically lots of other stuff that we also do in the space. But now let's get started with the intro into SSI. And then I will give you also a little bit of insight into ID Union, which is a large-scale project in Germany and stuff that's happening in connection with that. And then we can have a couple of questions before we go later then into the panel where I can answer more. So what is self-sovereign identity? It's kind of a new paradigm of digital identity management. And as I briefly indicated, this is more about smaller sets of data that we pass around in this trust triangle that you see here. And this is a chart that is taken from the Sovereign Foundation white paper from 2018. And the terminology has evolved a bit. So I've indicated that also in the slide, but it basically what it boils down to is that we have a trust relationship between issuers, holders, and verifiers. And if you look at this, what's happening in this triangle, you will see similarities to a wide variety of use cases that you know from your daily lives. So it all relates to an issuer giving certain data attributes about you, the formerly called owner, now we call them holder, in a structured data format that we call verifiable credential. So he basically attests certain attributes about you as a holder, and then the next round you can go to a verifier that knows the issuer and present certain data items that he asks of you. So a very simple use case would be you have a driver's license from a registered driver's license agency, which is issued to you in a form of a verifiable credential. And then you get into a police stop and they ask for your driver's license. And then you present the driver's license to them and they trust it, that it's valid because they know the document that's coming from the issuer they expect. This is a very government public oriented example, but there are many other examples which we can look into later on. So, and this is all underpinned technologically with cryptographic assurance, which means that the issuer is giving you the data set that you store yourself. And this is now where it comes to the self-sovereign piece in self-sovereign identity, which you then can present to the issuer, to the verifier on request. And the beauty of it that you can only disclose also selected attributes out of your data set. So in the driver's license example, so maybe it's not necessary to know your name and your birth date, but which class of vehicle you're allowed to drive. So the verifier can just ask for this one specific piece of information, and you give him this piece of information out of a wider set of data items that you have. And this is basically the understanding and the great metric of self-sovereign identity. And this is something that you will encounter often if you look into the space of self-sovereign identity. So what it is, where is it coming from, and what was kind of the baseline where this all started? So you may be familiar with a technology called public key infrastructure, which is kind of a centralistic method of giving you a certificate which confirms certain data items about you. So basically, if you have a certificate to sign and encrypt emails, this is a PKI certificate, which comes from a trusted authority, which is called certificate authority, which is based on a completely defined regulatory frameworks, data standards, and so on. And this is widely used throughout the world, also particularly in enterprise settings and also government settings where this is already flying. This obviously relies on this central entity issuing the credentials and the certificates. And this is actually also a single point of failure. And this has already happened, that certificate authorities got compromised and basically all the certificates had to be reissued. In the SSI world now, we have a completely decentralized and flexible setup, which means that any participant in such a network can actually act as his own certificate authority because he can define certain data sets in forms of verifiable credential definitions that he would like to issue, and can issue basically any data set and data format in a verifiable credential that he likes. So basically, you can become your own issuer of verifiable credentials and be your own certificate authority. And this is all based around standardization work that's already ongoing, for example, under the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, which basically defines the internet standards. And they have also defined certain standards like verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers to identify organizations on such networks. So this is, as I said, a new paradigm that also creates new opportunities for existing identity providers. This is this IDP term, meaning the organizations and also to some extent government organizations who today are acting as an identity provider, because we can now have a completely flexible setup and have an ecosystem that allows integration into this identity network, basically flexibly for basically any entity that you have. And the beauty of it is, and this is the key enabler for digitalization, you can integrate entities who have never interacted before. So meaning, even though you want to read certain data items from an issuer that you know, and you know the credential types that there are, you don't have to ask him first for the data, because you know that your clients will come with the data items of this verifiable credential that you can use. So in fact, you can work with data without having specified an interface upfront with the issuer. And this kind of enables a new type of data ecosystem that wasn't possible before. So the term self-sovereign identity is in fact a little bit misleading, because it's not just an identity management piece, but a way of, on a trustworthy way, exchanging data items in a secure and cryptographic manner, and enabling certain processes and business models and transactions without the parties having to agree upfront on a common interface. And this is kind of a very powerful instrument that we're having there. And yeah, as we are moving on, we see lots of new opportunities in various spaces for trust service providers and digital identity providers to move their existing business models to a decentralized way with SSI. So to give you one example of what could be done with self-sovereign identity mechanisms, and I just have this slide here. If we have a little bit of time later, I may even give you a demo, but I didn't want to stress the time now. But what we can do with verifiable credentials is basically do a password-less, completely easy login for end users to systems based on the attributes that they carry around with them in their verifiable credentials in their wallet apps. So the easiest way is to present for an application, that any kind of web-enabled application with a standard login mechanism, you can present, instead of a login with username password, you present a QR code, which the end user scans with his smartphone and the wallet app application where all the credentials are stored. And based on this connection that happens in this moment, the organization running the website can basically ask the user for the elements that the website wants to see for giving the access. And in the next logical second, the end user can confirm that he wants to provide this data, and the application in the back end then decides, okay, I'm satisfied with what I see. To make it a little bit more tangible, we use this internally, for example, for our applications to access certain internal applications like wikis and time recording systems and so on. So basically, all our employees have these certificates which confirm they are in fact members of the organization, and based on the membership of the organization, so they prove they are esatus employees, they can access the applications. And this is all turnkey ready and working today, and is applied in a wide variety of use cases already. This interacts, and this is just a little bit of a technical slide, interacts with standard authentication and authorization protocols that applications speak today. Like you may have heard about OpenID Connect and SAML and OAuth 2 and LDAP and all this good stuff. And this kind of works as a bridge to SSI and verifiable credentials today out of the box. So that was the first part of it, a little bit of a theoretical briefing on SSI. And now I will switch the presentation to the ID Union presentation, which is one of the large-scale German initiatives about self-sovereign identity, which is co-funded by the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. There are different initiatives, but I'm just pointing out this one, which is called ID Union, which was started already in last year in the competition phase and has as target to create an ecosystem for trusted identities, which is completely based on self-sovereign identity. And we have been in a fierce competition with 11 projects, but ID Union and 3 others were chosen for execution in the next 3 years, with a budget of 15 million euro, which we receive from the Federal Ministry, and all the private sector partners have to bring the same amount as well. So ID Union has been kicked off in April 1st, and the other projects, the other 3 in May and August. And ID Union is consisting of 15 core partners as consortium partners. So you see the names there. You see big international names like Siemens and Bosch, and the banks like Commerzbank and ING Bank, and a little bit, well, GS1 obviously is also a big international player, and German players like Bundesdruckerei, which is the agency which issues the German identity cards and the passports and so on, and a couple of research partners and universities. And we get, in fact, we are getting too many requests for ID Union these days. So we could have a very, very long list of associated partners, which keeps on growing, but we probably have to go to a stop at some point, because the response is just too overwhelming, and everyone wants to now get a glimpse into what's going on and participate in the project. It's completely based on this self-sovereign identity paradigm with a distributed ledger underneath. And the interesting part of it is, even though it's a German project, it's targeted at a European audience, because besides the project, there is already a plan to create a legal entity which basically executes the governance around the distributed ledger. That's basically the fundament for making all that happen. And this is a European legal entity type, a European cooperative. I will come to that in a second. And this will allow us to also incorporate new members out of EU member states, plus Norway, UK, and Switzerland, which were exactly included into the statutes that this is possible. This is again a picture about showing that this is the wallet app with a PKI and with decentralized PKI in the network, and this is what I already had in my introduction presentation. So this is interesting to see that these partners already have created a test network which enables all this self-sovereign identity work, and this list is also ever growing, but this is still test stage. But all the use cases that we have already created in the sectors that you see here are already running on the test network and could be basically switched to production instantly. Yeah, a couple of technology pieces have already been made available on the wallet app side. You see from Main Incubator the Lissi wallet, or from us the esatus wallet, and for the back-end solutions we have also something from Lissi and esatus, and partners like Bosch, Daimler, and Siemens have also created their own agents. Now, quickly, before I come to a close, the SCE, which is the European cooperative model, which is chosen for running the governance of the organization. This is a kind of a not so widely known legal entity type, which is it's a real EU legal entity. So you need, in fact, at least two founding members from 2 different EU member states to start it off. But then the model is open to get organizations from whatever you define in your statutes. So we have a wide variety of use cases which are planned for implementation. More than 35, and the list is probably growing over time as we move on. but these are the ones that have been chosen and planned already in various sectors, so not only public sector and e-government, but also classic industry verticals. And we have a strong focus on interoperability with the other projects and the standards out there, and are driven to corporations basically everywhere. And we obviously are tasked, as we are a publicly funded project, to build use cases which are of everyday relevance to the citizens and to the companies. Yeah. So this is a bit of a timeline. For me personally, it's sometimes not aggressive enough, but if we are able to create the cooperative this year and maybe even get the production network started, then I would be very happy. But obviously we have 3 years to get it all under good control and way. So yeah, this is basically the quick intro into ID Union. But before I close, I would like to point out that we have also a couple of other organizations and projects going on. So just the other day, so basically yesterday, a little bit more than 24 hours ago, there was a press conference in Berlin, which was hosted by the Ministry of Interior Affairs and also co-hosted by the German Chancellery, because there is also, driven by the German Chancellery, an SSI pilot project ongoing. And the first use case, which is hotel check-in for business travelers, was released yesterday. And so this was the first one in a series of use cases which are driven directly by the Chancellery. So this is in parallel to the ID Union, which is co-funded by the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. And this is now getting lots of attention, and we try to stay involved and make ourselves useful in that broader game. And the good message is this is all based on the same technological platform, Hyperledger, Indy, and Aries. So this will be fully compatible from day one if the activities are merged. And this is just a couple of examples from the German world, but actually self-sovereign identity is a global momentum, global movement. There's lots of bright people all over the world working on self-sovereign identity. Another country that is very strong is Canada, with initiatives driven by the government of British Columbia, and the great work they are doing with exactly the same technology stack. And lots of good work has also been going on for a couple of years in Finland, which is picking up more speed now. So the whole ecosystem is very much fueled by the energy that everyone is bringing in. And actually on the European broader level, we have an initiative from the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure called ESIF, European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework, which is unfortunately not compatible, but we are trying to build the bridges also there with the initiative that was mentioned in the beginning. We call it Network of Networks, which means we are creating bridge technology between all the different networks with universal resolvers, so that we kind of don't have the users think about which ledger they are on now. So we basically want to make it completely transparent that we have trustworthy ledgers which can basically work with one another, so that no one has to take care of it. This is what we call a network of networks. So there's lots of movement going on. And yeah, we are very excited, because we have been in this game for 5-6 years now. And now this is getting more mainstream and being talked about and being put into the open. And yeah, we are very bullish, so to say, to make stuff happen and work this year and the next years to come. Yeah, so that was basically my little intro. And
thank you, André. Thank you very much for this. It's really nice to see that things are working and starting to get momentum. I suggest, if you want to speak about the maybe Canadian, develop a little bit on this, we can do it in the panel later on. And because of this time constraints, I'd like, and maybe we can also discuss a few of the questions the audience might have during the panel, where we get back on these things. So I can give the floor immediately to, because of the time constraints, to Massimo, if he's still here. Yes.
I am. Thank you very much.
We're going into another field now, but we are all digital. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you very much for and also for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's I've already been learning a huge amount, so I'm really looking forward also to the discussion later on. I think for me, working in the humanitarian sector, it's very, very important to oxygenate the brain as much as possible, drawing from the examples of the application of technology at the cutting edge, particularly driven by data protection and privacy by design. So discussions of this type are very, very important. I think the idea is really to see how discussions of this type are relevant not just in our day-to-day life in Geneva, in Switzerland, and in Europe, but also actually could have major repercussions or positive impact also more globally, and particularly in extreme circumstances, like circumstances that are applicable in humanitarian emergencies. So maybe I would just actually like to start with a quick mention about the organization I work for and the humanitarian sector. Why data protection has come up as such an important topic for the humanitarian sector? Why it's so relevant, and how technologies are becoming increasingly predominant in the humanitarian sector, how they can support its action at the same time, what kind of risks they can give rise to, and at the end, really to spark then the discussion for after about what role there is there for multi-stakeholder engagement in ensuring the responsible deployment of technology. So to start with, the International Committee of the Red Cross, many of us today will know the organization quite well. Some may have heard about it, but in essence, I just want to really go through the description of the organization and the what it does, because in its description we find many of the essential components that will have a translation in the way in which we want to use technology. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, is a neutral, impartial, independent international organization that has an exclusively humanitarian mission to protect the life and the dignity of victims of armed conflicts and of other situations of violence, and to provide them with assistance. So there are four key concepts that are really worth stressing at the outset. First of all is the fact that our existence, we heard earlier about companies like Facebook, Tinder, Uber, and they process a lot of personal data, and they have leverage of technology, and they have certain objectives. The objective, the very existence of the organization in our case, is really aimed at protecting the life and the dignity of vulnerable people and to provide them with assistance in extremely volatile environments. We work in conflicts. Conflicts are really probably the most volatile type of environments, where actually the authorities that in our day-to-day life here we would consider as the safeguards preventing the exploitation of data and of the exploitation of the rights and of the abuse of the rights of individuals, and standing in the way of the abuse of those rights may actually be authorities that have a stake in that conflict. And so a lot of responsibility is based on humanitarian actors. I think a third element that is very important to really map and define how we approach this kind of use of technology is that in order to be able to deliver on that mandate, we need to have a direct physical presence with affected populations and a proximity element. The fourth element is that actually that proximity is very much based on trust and on the perception that the organization is and remains at all times neutral, impartial, and independent, and that everything that is being done is exclusively humanitarian. So this is actually very often linked with confidentiality, and the confidentiality supported by bilateral confidential dialogue with the parties to the conflict. We call this, and we summarize all this with one expression, niha, which sounds a little bit like the cowboys, and sometimes it feels like being in the far west, but it really stands for neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian action. So these are very, very simple concepts in principle, and concepts with which people can connect relatively easily. But we find that actually, while they're so simple to understand, they're extremely difficult to apply in practice. And actually, in the use of technology, they become even more challenging in the use of new technologies and of advanced technologies. So this is actually probably why data protection becomes so important. So if we look closely at privacy and data protection and what data protection is all about, we actually see dignity at its very core. Dignity left, right, and center. Data protection is actually about safeguarding the rights and the dignity of individuals. All those, for anybody who had to go through a data protection a piece of data protection law, it can be quite a painful and excruciating exercise of very tedious and detailed legalistic provisions about specification of purpose, retention of data, data transfers, transparency, provision of information, onward sharing, and so on. But all of those provisions are very concrete reflections about how to translate the application of the implementation of the assurance of the respect of the dignity of individuals when processing personal data. So we see that really the objective of data protection laws and the objective of an organization that is so active in humanitarian action are actually aligned. So it's not like for the commercial sector, often data protection is actually a barrier or an impediment or something that is there to stand in the way between excessive or use or exploitation of data. It's actually for us an enabler to ensure that we carry on in our work being, we say, beneficiary centric, keeping the individual at the center with a concept of agency where an individual can still have a notion of control. We've been hearing earlier also about how important it is to have a sense of what's going on behind your back, and what is being done with your information. So ensuring that data cannot be exploited by third parties, for example, to somebody's detriment. When we look at an organization like the ICRC, have been around for more than 150 years in such type of conflicts and volatile environments. Protecting individuals' personal data has been the bread and butter of the organization for a very long time. And we know that protecting persons' information is protecting the person themselves, him or herself. So why so much focus on data protection? We've been doing it for such a long time to care about people and to care about their information. The reason is probably new technology, and I mean it's strange to be saying this with such an expert audience, but we all know that technology has been evolving, developing since the beginning of times. But what is really exceptional for the last 10, 20 years is its capacity to generate enormous amounts of data, and not just to generate them, but also to capture them. And to capture them and store them, and to keep them cheaply and efficiently in data centers that are increasing and growing every day. And not only that, but also to make sense of that data in ways that would have been unimaginable before, correlating data sets that have got nothing to do one with another to draw knowledge out of them. So all this knowledge obviously brings incredible opportunities to do great things. We've been hearing about possible commercial exploitation and generation of value and wealth, but we can also imagine humanitarian applications of this technology, finding missing persons, or predicting the possible displacement of affected communities in response to a natural disaster, and pre-locating humanitarian aid, or being able to identify vulnerable communities very efficiently and effectively, and administering humanitarian aid in these manners. We can think of countless applications of this kind of technology, but we can also think of all the possible ways in which this technology can be abused and misused. And we've been hearing about it earlier. Some examples, we've been hearing about the example of Cambridge Analytica. We've been hearing about also, well, everybody is aware of all the possible types of abuse and exploitation that can be done thanks to access to this technology and the data that sits behind it, from government surveillance to we've been hearing about commercial surveillance and the new corporate surveillance model. So this is why all these very strong laws are developing and are trying to address it. We could be discussing also the questions that was raised earlier about the effectiveness of some of these laws in addressing this. It's compliance. In my previous life, I was an antitrust lawyer, and I know that it's something that is not just specific to data protection. The fact that the law is somehow always catching up, and that large commercial enterprises, they're pushing the boundaries as much as they can to leverage as much profit they can, including from conduct that they may be aware is not necessarily compatible with the law. So laws are coming up to try and shield from abuse, but the tensions are always there, and it's not always straightforward to deal with them. But it is also, just in the same way as societies have been developing this more stringent regulatory regime, also in the humanitarian sector, we're looking very carefully at the application of data protection principles to our work, to really understand and to use it as a lens to read technology and data processing and enable us to leverage to the maximum possible extent technology, which is a great thing, while making sure that we don't give rise to possible abuse and harm. So the response and the uptake of technology in the humanitarian sector is something that is very real. It's probably not as fast-paced as outside, and hopefully so, because the implications of getting it wrong, the paradigm of testing and failing, the implications of failing in this kind of environments is extremely harsh and hard, and you wouldn't want to test on the life of people that are in such situations of vulnerability. But it's still something that is very real, the uptake of technology. And it's real not because of the techno enthusiasm for everything that is new and technology leaning. It's real because the challenges that the humanitarian sector is facing are actually evolving, and they're making the use of technology almost compulsory. We have an obligation to make sure that we take all possible measures to be as effective and efficient, to be close to affected communities, and to respond efficiently. Conflicts last longer. The average duration of the 10 biggest contexts in which the ACRC has been working, is working today, is over 35 years. This means that people are increasingly relying on assistance in the longer term. And so where we move from an immediate emergency scenario to a protracted crisis, the idea or the need to make sure that we can deliver something that is more sustainable and efficient through cash programs, for example, or linking that to the use of biometrics to be able to identify effectively and efficiently a person, and making sure that there's no duplication, and the programs can run in the longer term, and the identity type of considerations that were mentioned before become incredibly relevant. In humanitarian settings, biometric data has been taken up. There are some organizations that are today sitting on the biometric data of more than 10 million people. And so the challenges that come with it are very significant. The challenges also that we are facing come from the fact that conflict theaters become more volatile and difficult to read. You no longer have the ACRC, that we have been mentioning, has been there for a long time. Well, at the beginning, you would have in the countryside one army dressed up in blue facing an army dressed up in red, shooting at each other outside of inhabited centers. Today is no longer that clear cut. We are facing parties to a conflict that are very fragmented, splinter groups that emerge every day. Understanding who you're talking to is very often very complex. Who do you negotiate access with? And the knowledge that you can actually leverage through artificial intelligence and the reading of social media data about who the relevant stakeholders might be and who is influential in one area and another could be incredibly relevant. We are talking about the challenges of providing. I mentioned earlier how important it is to be physical, to have access and proximity. But we also know that it's incredibly challenging to have access because of what I mentioned earlier. You do not know who to negotiate with, and it's becoming increasingly dangerous and risky. We regularly have colleagues abducted, unfortunately, occasionally also killed, and understanding how we can leverage digital proximity to complement physical proximity through messaging apps, platform, social media, or interacting securely through certain types of applications and platforms, or using drones becomes incredibly useful and relevant. So the impact of using technology can potentially be incredibly positive, but the impact of getting it wrong can be extremely severe. So really understanding how to do no harm, which is one of the mantras of humanitarian action, is paramount, is a very important obligation. Some of the specific challenges that also come in the uptake of technology by a humanitarian organization is that it's also a question of the paradigm shift that some of this technology brings. Before taking up certain technologies, our relationship with affected population was very direct, immediate, real, and physical. We were in the same office. A person would come to us with a very difficult story that we would perhaps write down on paper and have that one copy of the notes that we would have. And on the basis of what we would hear, we would trigger some protection action and perhaps provide the person with humanitarian assistance. Now, in protracted situations or through cash programs, all of a sudden, there's a number of stakeholders that come in the picture potentially, whether it be cloud-based solutions providers for the collection of case files and case information, or in the provision of cash in terms of assistance, you all of a sudden need to have a financial service provider and potentially a mobile phone operator that will not only have some of that information to be able to deliver that assistance on your behalf, but they will also actually generate new information about affected populations. And we may not even be aware of the type of metadata that is being generated about these transactions. So those organizations will have commercial drivers, and we will need to make sure that in our interactions with them, we're fully aware, to the extent that we can control, that we control the way in which these organizations generate and process that data. To the extent that we cannot control it, we need to be aware of the possible risks that are going to be generated and be accountable for those risks. Also, aside from the commercial possible exploitation of that type of information, those entities will not be benefiting from the same privileges and immunities and status that an international humanitarian organization has. So they will be subject to the jurisdiction potentially of states that have a stake in the conflict. So understanding clearly the data flows, the processors, the sub-processors, the stakeholder mapping that is behind a particular solution becomes incredibly important. And really data protection is a tool for us to be able to do that. The last word that I'd like to say is that obviously we cannot do that by ourselves. We cannot be, as a humanitarian sector, alone in doing this. We don't have the skill sets, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the understanding of the full spectrum of challenges. We need to be working with academia, we need to be working with the corporate sector, we need to be working with data protection authorities and privacy commissioners, we need to be working across the board to really make sure that everybody contributes to the reflection and the discussion. So this is why we have some important partnerships and here with the PFL, for example, and the Swiss Data Protection Commissioner, but globally with a number of academic institutions, corporate sector, and data protection authorities. So all that is to say that really we need to bring everyone together behind this, and we're trying to do this through the creation of guidelines, guidance on the responsible use of technology. A handbook was published on data protection and humanitarian action, talking about some of the technologies that I mentioned earlier. We need to do research and development. to make sure that where guidance is not sufficient, we move the state of the art in technology to where we need to be. And learning, which is very important for us as well, and that we're working on with the EPFL. I just realized that I've been talking for far too long, and I thought I didn't have many things to say, so I'll hand it over directly back to Gerald. Sorry for the extra minutes.
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you for your view from the field, because sometimes we're a bit, in the technology, we're a bit away from this proximity with the field and the need of the people. May I suggest, unless there is a very urgent, burning question, that we might get back to a few of the things you mentioned, or maybe understand that the ICRC might be interested in some of the processes André has been describing, as soon as André can confirm that it is totally safe on the field. But let's discuss that maybe later, because let's switch maybe to because we have time constraints and we're running a little bit out of time, go to the sort of a second part of this event, which is a more relaxed panel discussion on a few of these matters. We can develop a few of the things that have been mentioned. And Philippe, maybe to launch this panel, you give us maybe a small introduction into where we are and where we want to go and what we want to discuss. Sure,
I'll be happy to do so, even though I do think the task is kind of challenging, because opening a panel needs to have a focused discussion. Relax on such a difficult situation, a discussion might not be easy. But the point I will make is, I found amazing in the 3 presentations we had today. We started with Paul-Olivier that shows things at a very personal level, how we can be trapped on a platform. And when you think about either Tinder or Uber, you see that the word dignity could be put back behind this, because yes, there were good things with all this data collected. They could be good or bad, and in the end, it's going to be about dignity of the humans behind whether it's used, and dignity of the humans also working for Uber, because it's really all over the place. Then André showed that it's not only about human, but it's at the full scale. The whole European Union is investing a lot of resources in trying out various things, showing that there is really a global problem. And dignity is the back on the field from in the mouth of Massimo, and this shows that it's really a total global problem. And I will say this is also what we discussed last week. So I will maybe focus the panel, or at least start the discussion on the panel with this question, whether the whole problem actually that evolved from this beautiful creation of the web that was really about getting together collective intelligence. That was really the purpose of the web protocol that started at CERN. Why did they want to do that? To share information. And this purpose lived for many years. Now it has evolved to something else. And I think this is normal in a sense, because we evolved from a few 100,000 of users to 3 billion. And as we discussed 2 weeks ago, now it's 3 billion people, but we'll be very soon the minority over the internet, because all these beautiful devices that should help actually the humanity to work will also be present on the internet. So this big evolution we have to take care of. And that's in that scale that the question we will maybe start the panel is about whether we should not put value on data like we do today, but on the data usage. And to illustrate my thinking, to launch that, I will share my screen. Working? Do you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll show you just in one slide, actually, what we discussed, what could be taken as the outcome of the similar discussion that took place here at the Clusis 2 weeks ago. At the time, the question of the panel was about, can we regain control of our data with the current governance model? There was not really a debate. It was more like a status that, yes, there is a problem. And this problem was stated in these very general terms of control over value, this equation you see on the right. And control over value is something that is nothing digital per se. It's really generic terms. Nothing happens if you don't value something. And if you have a value, you need to have this control to degenerate any type of economic transaction. And this is what humans have been doing for the past thousands of years. And 30 years ago, digitalization became very widespread. And now we are living in this hyper-connected world where our digital life, as Paul-Olivier showed before, is actually observed by other people. So then the value in the digital sector is different. And 2 weeks ago, we approached it from the three angles, from the technology, legal aspect, and societal aspect. On the technology, we stressed how security is absolutely necessary. And here it's not simply the security of having bigger firewall. No, it's a security that goes back to the root of the internet, the root how actually data are authenticated to the person, how you actually prove that you are the owner of this data. And the summary will be, the outcome of the discussion was that this type of security that provides back the authentication is actually linked to our personal freedom, where we can actually prove our ownership of the data without without relying on a specific platform or a centralized aspect. So this was the first start. It started with security and the need of decentralization. When we moved to the legal aspect, it shows that data protection is absolutely necessary, but it's only the start, because data is flowing in all parts of society. So actually you are touching many types of law, and we discussed contract law. And when we moved with Professor Jean-Henri Morin to the societal aspect and this concept of data usage as a liability, that's where we see that data protection is not only for individual, it's actually across the board. And it has to be thought also in terms of community, states, governments, or the public sector, but also within the enterprise and private sector. So at the outcome of May 4th, we had it was a pretty clear statement that we need some alternative, but what they were. Today we saw a few presentations. And here, if we look at the vision of what we are doing now and what we should be by 2030, why 2030? It's because it's also a reminder that the UN Sustainable Development Goal have this target date of 2030. Due to the scale of the problem, if solutions are not in place by 2025, it will be difficult to get meaningful things happening. So now we know we have an alternative that exists in terms of using the data differently. And I will present now in a few words what we do at the Human Colossus Foundation. And I will do it on one slide because we are a bit on the technology side, and this was not really the topic of this discussion today. But when we think about that, moving toward the dynamic data economy, it is about, the word dynamic is very important. It's about the flow of data, the usage of the data. Currently, we are living in an economy where owning the data has value, and it generates a lot of behavior that are very difficult to handle. And this dynamic data economy has to be human-centric. Why human-centric? Because that's where you restart to build in the digital world the whole set of communities that we have created. I'm a Swiss citizen, but I'm not only that. I'm part of my family. I work in a bank. There are all these elements that build up your identity, and all these communities have been created on the physical world. They're protected with regulation, laws, and all the guidelines we have put in place in our usual physical world. Now, in the digital space, that did not happen for a very natural reason. We didn't need to happen a few years ago. Remember that in the 1950s, the chief executive of IBM was seeing the whole world market of computer. There will be maybe 5 or 6 computers in the world. Today, we are a completely different picture. So all this design that we're putting decentralization on some computer has completely gone. And now we see this phase of decentralization taking place. It's not only me saying that. Actually, if you look at the IT strategy of Europe, they push for decentralized system all over the place. So human-centric is really the basis on which we can rebuild, I think, a digital economy that has the same security we have, we are currently used into the physical world. I'm not saying that the physical world is perfect. As Massimo just said, the existence of the ICRC is a proof that there is many things to change in the world, but at least we have a hope to rebuild the same protection which works in some places. And once this human-centric perspective is taken from the start, from the design, then you can really think about the data flow as the thing that needs to value. And this is what we represent here. Because when we speak about data, actually, it's always because we see data in a certain usage. And that's where we have to become a bit more aware of the complexity of the technology, that when we speak about the data flows, we have to start with the data inputs, then it moves to system that will handle, manage the data. That's what is called usually data captures by the specialist, before actually going to the real data exchange, which we all understand. When the European community issued this Data Governance Act, it's all about data exchange. But if the technology on the upper part of this graph is not really in place, if you don't have a way to properly handle in a human-centric way these things, it's going to be, again, focalized on the platform. And the problem of having things centralized on the platform has Paul-Olivier showed it. In the Uber case, you have temptation, you have economical temptation, you have distortion, you create actors that you can't really control. Now, when it moves to the humanitarian sector, Massimo explained that these sometimes even the actors controlling this centralized platform might be part of the conflicts. And this is why, again, here the human centricity is absolutely necessary to predict. So at the Human Collaboration, we really are the specialists of decentralization, and we came out with this picture to actually identify in whichever data flows we have centralization appearing, and where we can actually change something, because we don't think there is one simple application or a simple protocol or a simple standard that will actually bring things together. So by starting what André spoke about, self-sovereign identity is really sitting here at this input level, how you can authenticate with who you are interacting over the internet. And this is really this decentralized authentication that needs to be put. But once you have that, you need to know how you interact between two actors. And you know, you have all been on the internet, so you all know the problems of cookies. You basically have the understanding of the exchange or the connection is being imposed on you. You don't have really a choice. Now it's getting a little bit better, but you are imposed on the way of what is this data and how should I use it. A good example is this concept of PII, privately identifiable information, which I think started in the Anglo-Saxon worlds, how to flag information that will be private. But what is private? Private will depend on the user, on the context. So you need to have this ability to deal with the context, what we call the semantic. And you have to do it in a deterministic way. And this is where we call that decentralized semantic, where the semantic is posed on a specific user. It can be made contextual. So the whole things will be a total chaos if it was not governed. And that's where you have the concept of authorization and access management, which is in technical terms already pretty well decentralized. But when, oh, sorry, there's a typo here, but when you move to governance, when you have the above two technologies, you can actually think of a decentralized governance. So from this more technological flow of the data, we don't see the human. The humans, I will just mention one example, one proof of concept we are working on. And the idea is here, it's really to show this basic concept to value the flow of data, not the ownership of data. It's a concept we do as part of the New Generation Internet program of the European Union, where the goal was to digitalize the yellow book of the World Health Organization for the yellow fever passport. So I must say here, we started this work before the COVID-19 pandemic. So it has nothing to do with the digital passport we are hearing today, but it shows why it is so complex. Our idea in the beginning was simply to expose why the World Health Organization was never able to digitalize properly this yellow book, which many travelers are using. Well, it's because the above three steps could not be decentralized. It was impossible to build an application that will work in all contexts. So it was creating silos in which we're making actually the digitalization irrelevant. So this just to show you in a more data flows format, which people might more be used, how user centricity appears in this framework of decentralized authentication, decentralized semantic, and decentralized governance. It was in the case of a vaccine, or yellow fever vaccine. When you get, as a user, your vaccine, the way you identify yourself with the hospital or your doctors is something that is done in that context. It has nothing to do with the context you will be presenting your vaccine credential either to an officer checkpoint, if we have to go that way nowadays with Health Pass, or whether it's for governmental studies or for further analytical work. So all that is, all these pictures were actually to show you that this concept of data flow is very important, and valuing the data flow, that's maybe the question I would like to start the discussion of the panel, is about whether we should not move into an area where the value is really on the data flows instead of owning the data. And by saying that, I'm basically putting myself really in a camp that from an economic perspective is really not related to what the current governance model are in place, but I think it's still worth to be discussed.
I don't know who wants to take up the question or the subject. I don't know whether there was a question. Maybe I had one impression, because of course, my perspective is very limited. It's a legal perspective, so it's a bit difficult to go way beyond this. But if we heard different perspectives, some are more technical, some are more global, some are more individual. But if we try to follow up your question, Philippe, and the discussion, you mentioned there's something in the public we all talk about today is the COVID passport, or whatever you call it. If each one of you, because it has the concept of passport, even for ICRC, which we understand, it's a totally different mandate, totally different perspective. It's not commercial, it's protection. But passport means something important. It means maybe access to something, or an additional freedom to do something. So it also probably means something for very specific in your vision, André, as you explained with SSI, Philippe also, and if we take just in mind this COVID, I don't know how it's called today, COVID or health passport. How does it relate to all the things each one of you has mentioned? If I start with you, I mean, Philippe, you asked a question, so we are answering by question to you. That's because I was raised by the Jesuits. They always answer questions with another question. But how do you see? You said it was difficult and not possible. What is the problem? With this, we have hundreds. We hear about hundreds of solutions. There's a Swiss one, a European one. Is this something they do or don't do in relation, for example, to SSI or decentralization, the two concepts you mentioned?
So the current status is, yes, they try. Many organizations try to do a health passport. I think that would be maybe a common term that is used across the board. But even at this term, the semantic is important and shows what is the root of the problem. When we say passport, we forget that when you show your passport, when you have to show it first, the person in front of you will accept it, not because it is a nice looking passport, but because there's a trust element between the two organizations, the two governments, the two countries that respect this. My Swiss passport is accepted in that passport. And this is something that is rooted in international agreement, not into an opaque platform that you don't control. I come back to think of the example of Paul-Olivier. If you don't put this credential, this value of trust into something that everyone trusts, no one will trust this passport. So that means for a health passport, I think there will be a good adoption if IATA says a travel passport is going, because yes, I'm buying a plane ticket, I know I have to do a few things. So IATA might have a power to decide, okay, you need to do to provide a few more information. That was fine up to the pandemic, because the pandemic now asks, instead of telling that you have paid your ticket, you have the right visa to enter, you have to provide some health data. And that's where people started to react. Health data, that's my data. Now the thinking started. Do I really want to give all this data simply to take an airplane? And now when you look and when you want to actually build a travel pass to be meaningful, and the meaningful question related to the current pandemic is, are you propagating are you a risk of propagation of the disease? Well, actually, a test might be the best solution, but there are other information you need to pass. And when you start to look at the data you need to transfer, it starts to grow. And you are making this passport data, which was based, I will say, on a trust, legal trust between countries, to health data, which is flexible, which is changing all the time, because especially for the current pandemic, it's not like yellow fever was an easy case. That's why we chose that initially, because there was a global agreement that the yellow fever vaccine is one shot. It was a scientific agreement first, one shot, lifelong protection. That's the key things. Then the next thing is the World Health Organization managed to get an overall agreement that this type of vaccine was actually effective for the pandemic, and then the business interest of protection in the country between rich and poor was agreed. So this is agreed. Now, it's clear with any other type of vaccine, that did not really happen. I'm not an expert, but we didn't find any other vaccine where this was possible. So that shows it's not about the technology simply bringing the capacity to bring some information. You have to respect the context. And that's where the decentralization comes in. So the status as of today, what we see is that we had predicted that there will not be one passport. There will be many of them. And in Switzerland, I think we have already a few versions, a few ideas how to do it. Now, there are some in European Union. So just think, if you are using this passport, this travel pass to travel, it's easy to get a picture on your iPhone or your smartphone. But how do you make sure that this picture is actually recognized as valid somewhere else? They will be working on a different platform. So it's getting much more complex at that level. Now, it could work, but we forget that there may be something simpler. The paper attestation you receive today is still working, and you avoid this problem. So that's where that's like the one André is showing. And this is, we are not against technology here, but we are just careful about the impact. I know actually of lawyers who had a Swiss digital gray card for his motorcycle when he crossed the Greek frontier. And we all know it doesn't exist. But in the context, the only thing he could show was a gray card on his mobile phone, which the border accepted because there were contextual elements showing that actually this piece of paper could work. This image could work. So it shows the debate.
It was only because the lawyer looked trustful. Exactly.
It's about trust. So that's the difficulty. I think it's a misperception that this passport could lead to reopening of, and there's a huge pressure for everyone to go back to a restaurant, to have a good coffee, and to go. But this digitalization of a passport today will not help, because today it's very hard, and André knows. I mean, you saw his progression for the whole very organized German way of testing self-sovereign identity. We are speaking of 3 years. And today, what was announced, maybe we can switch something more concrete, specific, but the announcement that was made yesterday about this hotel chain using SSI-based credential for hotel booking, this is still in pilot phase, very confident it's an easy one. So here, I think there's a huge pressure to do a lot of things. And I think
Philippe, if I may interrupt, I mean, because I always jump to the easy ones, because these are the ones I understand. If we bring the hotel, I don't know whether André, you mentioned the hotel
yes.
thing. Can you give us just an example where what you talked about, SSI, and how in this very specific hotel example, how it works.
Yeah.
You said it works, so
yeah.
I think it would be nice to know how it relates to what you showed us before.
Absolutely. So this is the thing, hotel check-in for business travelers, which is a specific scenario. So what you actually need to do for hotel check-in is you have to prove your address of residency. So your legal address. You have to prove your legal address where you actually live when you check into a hotel. This holds true for everyone. But as a business traveler, you usually want an invoice which has the right address of your company and not your personal address, which frequently happens, as you probably know. You're also business travelers once in a while, so you get the wrong invoice address. So what actually would need to happen is you would ideally submit this vetted information upfront in the check-in process.
Could someone, we have microphones on, could some of the people turn the microphones off?
Check, we can turn them off ourselves if we find out who it is. Yeah, now there is silence. So the ideal scenario is that you have a trusted data set of your residency address and a trusted data set of your company address. And what we do in this case, we get two credentials. The first one is we get a digital representation of the German EID card as a verifiable credential. So point one, so it's easy, it's a process. You hold it to the NFC of your smartphone, and the Bundesdruckerei, who issues these cards, is issuing a verifiable credential. So you have all the data that's on this thing on a verifiable credential. So point one solved. And now the organization, so the home organization of the person who's traveling, so the employer, is handing out a credential which gives the official address of the organization, which is the invoicing address. And now when you check in, you do exactly as I've shown on this one slide. The hotel presents you with this QR code. You scan the QR code. You get a proof request from the hotel to submit these two pieces of information, and this is automatically verified in the back end that it's valid, that it's from the right issuer, and it's automatically transmitted to their hotel operation and back office system. So there's no way of manual introduction of errors. No one is typing anything in because it's just coming from the credential, which is coming from the original issuer with a trustworthy set of data. Which can even be proven that it's wasn't revoked since it was issued, it wasn't tampered with, and it's come from the issuer that is as expected. So we just use the technology to eliminate this manual interventions and breaking points. And obviously, if we now look at the Corona passport thing, actually you can ideally use this technology for doing all this stuff. So, but this is the ethical question if we are supposed to do this. So we can always use the technology for a very good thing, which is very easy to understand, so that you transport the data because you check into the hotel. But if you now have to present a vaccination credential or a 24-hour issued test credential with the hotel check-in, this is an ethical debate. And basically, the technology is there to do both, and it's upon us to prevent that the bad thing happens with the technology. So about doing it right with the technology. So that's kind of the example and bridging these two scenarios even.
Could this technology, for example, I mean, bringing it back to the passport, allow, because it's about regaining the control over personal data and not exchanging too much, not exchanging what you don't want to exchange. Now, if you think of the COVID and the health data on this, could it be possible to technically using SSI or that technology to show to an authority or a customs authority, you want to go into a country or you want to board an airplane, saying, well, it's disconnected to my identity, but the bearer of this device, my iPhone, for which I have my fingerprints maybe, but you don't have my name yet. You can link it. The bearer of this is COVID negative. You don't need to know my name. You don't need to know the history. Is this something that is the sort of workable concept with SSI?
It is fully workable, but obviously it depends on a variety of things on this chain, which creates this data set of the test credential, right? So actually, first you have to be identifiable based on ideally something that's government issued identity credential. Let's assume this for a second. Then when you get to the test center, actually you have to be identified by this data because they issue a credential that matches your name. So then when you go to the next stage where you present the test credential, actually they have to somehow identify that the credential with the test result, the negative one, was issued to you. So you basically have to give them some means of correlating your identity document with the test document. And this actually requires disclosure of a certain piece of identity information that makes them sure that this test credential was issued to you and not to someone else from whom you obtained it because you just know him or for whatever it is.
Okay. This is a very important point of SSI. It's not about doing it all on my side alone. You are just managing the context in which you have to prove the identity. Exactly. The yellow fever vaccine we built, we had two ways of identifying someone. Someone can be identified through the standard digital ID, a little bit like André presented, but using an eIDAS compatible identification, which allows the hospital in Austria, we built that in Austria, to actually verify your name. But we were also wanted a system that works anywhere. So we have a biometric identification. On the biometric identification, identify only, or in this case, the dual iris scan. That's the only thing. There's no other data in this biometric template. So that means you can then design a system where later on, the way you will be proving you are yourself is going through a totally different system than the standard passport names identification, but with a biometric identification. So this choice of how you are identified, that needs to be somehow staying with the user, the human that is interacting in a certain context. I'm a Swiss, so I know my Swiss passport has a validity, I can use it. But I can be in a difficult situation at the other end of the world where suddenly I realize that my Swiss passport is actually a liability to me, so I will not show it to you. So this is the whole concept of self-sovereign identity, where you keep control of how you identify yourself, how you prove who you are, how you show that you are a trustworthy person. But it's not outside of any governance. It's how you basically decide which governance is going to prove who you are, whether it's a biometric one or a state one or any other one. And that's an important concept. And the second one is about how much data you flow. And that's as you said, Gerald, before, most of the people at the border, they don't care about you. They will just want to say, you are immune or you are allowed. Today, do you have a visa? If there is no other element, that's the only thing they will ask. So this yes-no system, they are very difficult to be used in larger society, especially in the humanitarian sector, where the context will be harder to justify. And here I'm relying to some discussion I had with people that were designing system for the entry of refugees in the southern part of Europe. How the contexts are so complex. How having a standard digital solution where if your fingerprint or your name or whatever is not on a specific centralized database, you are not allowed the entry, doesn't work, because you will always get something. And that was very difficult discussion to discuss with these people, that they knew that the system was not totally infallible. So they had to, I don't exactly know how they did it, but they simply doesn't work on a large scale. To come back maybe to a point that where Massimo is more positive, this similar technology, when applied right, when you respect this human dignity, could become more useful. And here, this is the example we worked on the, I mean, not personally, but some partners worked on the problem they had with the fishermen disappearing on the sea. in Southeast Asia, where the crisis was becoming so big that actually at some point the European Union threatened to an embargo on the fishery industry of that country. Now, that technology helped because by doing biometric tagging of the iris scan of the people walking on the boat and simply detecting that the same people were walking off the boat, they don't care about who it is. So they managed to get a migrant, largely undocumented working population to still work and protect them, because the captain of the boat has to demonstrate you have 10 people leaving and the same 10 people are coming out. So this is a case where the technology was used just to detect that the same person is coming out. Don't care about the rest. Even if you are an illegal worker, that was not the purpose of the technology. So it's all about this context that SSI is really powerful. It goes back to the human, and then you can reconstruct the structure needed to have a society working.
If human-centric goes back to human, there are about 8 billion people on the world. So they are each one seems to be a center. So that's quite human-centric, which is a strange word, human-centric, when you go on each individual. But leaving just this little bit technical discussion aside, Massimo, do you see any? Because you also deal on the field with individuals. They have their own threats, and do you see? I mean, without being technical or disclosing any, do you see any area where that sort of technology could be implemented or applied or even looked at, interesting?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think if there's one thing that the data protection mindset does that is extraordinary, is that it really focuses on what information for what use and access by who. And I think this is actually one of the key simple ways that enables the leveraging of all these solutions and technology. And the idea of a passport was discussed, and in the past, or with a physical passport, anybody who asks you for your passport has access to a lot of information, potentially sensitive information that is on your passport, and will have access to the whole thing. Now, digitalizing this makes it more risky, because it makes that information accessible potentially by many, and easily it's easy to replicate, and it's easy to correlate, and it's easy to gather additional information. Now, the use of technology, however, we've been hearing, actually gives you better opportunities to safeguard things in ways that could not have been done in a physical world. So, for example, this capacity to only present to the person you have in front of you the one element that is relevant is incredible. It's you don't need to show your place of birth and your name and you just need to present, for in some cases, to show that you are entitled to drive a vehicle, and or entitled to we've been hearing about entitled to travel. Do you need to show that you have been vaccinated? Do you need to show that, or is it sufficient to say that you're entitled to travel? Because you could have been, for example, just tested and the test is negative, or you could have been sick with COVID and therefore you're immune somehow in other ways. Do you need to show which one is the case, or do you need to show which vaccine you took? Perhaps if it is, as long as it's a valid vaccine that is accepted, you don't necessarily need to show which one and where you were vaccinated and how. You just need to present the fact that you have been in fact entitled to one thing. So the key thing is to really go back to the basics, which is what information is needed, by whom, and to do what. In some cases, we will find that actually we don't need all that much information. I don't need to know. In South Sudan, we drop food from the sky. Do I need to have the biometric data set of 11 million people to be able to distribute food? In South Sudan, it's not ideal. Now, I'm exaggerating because that's obviously not an ideal scenario. There's a whole series of issues with that. But it's just to say that really asking ourselves, what is the information that I actually really need before starting to collect information, and in the design of a system that manages this information is essential. And we've been hearing very, very enlightening examples about how this can be done. So it's been for me, it's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Massimo. Just because the time has run, just maybe a sort of a wrap-up question or comment, or question and comment. I quoted Professor Zuboff at the introduction. There's one other thing she's mentioning. She's talking about inequality. I mean, when she's talking about the big infrastructures, Amazon, Google, I mean, having all this information. Olivier Dehaye also showed what information people had, or these big networks had about other people, and how people were kind of slaves of that information, or trapped into that information. And she somehow says, well, there must be laws, regulations. In data protection, we have the purpose. I mean, you have only what you were mentioning, Massimo, only the data you need for a specific purpose. If you don't need it anymore, you throw it away, you destroy it, and you don't collect if you don't need it. We know that. My question is, and that's a wrap-up question. Maybe it's a conclusion, André. Is SSI, since we are getting back to the human-centric, totally decentralized, is it a weapon or a blow to the business model of Amazon, Facebook, Google, who are based on the huge amount of data they collect, they make profiles, they use, probably sell? Is this, or is it one of the weapons to regain some of the control, or is it something that is fundamentally, I mean, you mentioned the word paradigm a few times. Is it something that is fundamentally against that business model of building up the information on people and using it? The original term was inequality, because the person is in a totally unequal situation.
Yeah, at least it's a little bit of a starting point, right? So one of the key points that we can solve with self-sovereign identity is we don't have these centralistic identity providers like the GAFA that give you the login, and basically for all the services where you log in with your Google account or whatever, they can track what you have done. So basically this eliminates this cluster problem that we have. But actually, with this data collections that are happening from the big tech, this is not something that is solved by SSI alone, because SSI is not designed in this state as it is for handling big sets of data. So we need some other mechanism to kind of allow the user to store these larger amounts of data, or maybe even the algorithms themselves to process the data and create the outcomes that the big tech are used to. So this kind of gives another burden on us as end users to basically be able to know what is the data and know what are the algorithms and do stuff with it. And I think this is the big challenge. So all these merits that we sometimes have with this big data collections, we as end customers probably are not aware what they are doing, because we only see the results, and maybe they are good for us, maybe they are bad for us, but if we would have to do it ourselves, how would we do it? And SSI is just a cornerstone of re-enabling the empowerment with the tiny pieces of data, maybe some biometric data even at some point, but this big data, this is a whole different game.
Yeah. Okay. That seems to be one important conclusion. I may add to that even the big ones, for the big data, it's all built up on billions of small transactions. So if you start with the billions of small transactions, you probably have an influence on the big data also, and the possibility of profiles. It's micro transactions on data which you are targeting. Well, I think we're about 5 minutes above time. I just thank you everyone we all know we could go on a long time with this fascinating subjects. I don't know whether we lost our head chairwoman, Sylvie, to conclude. Sylvie, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much for everything.
So I give you the floor.
It was a real pleasure to hear you during these 2 hours, and thank you. I think that we will speak about that for another time, maybe next year. I think it will be necessary, but thank you very much. It was very interesting. Merci infiniment. C'était un plaisir de vous entendre tous les 5 sur le sujet. Je pense qu'on n'en a pas encore fait le tour. Et effectivement, l'identité personnelle. Moi, j'ai bien aimé Massimo Marelli quand il a bien dit à un moment donné, mais jusqu'où est-ce qu'on veut l'information? On veut aller jusqu'où et on veut qu'est-ce qu'on veut encore savoir? On veut tout savoir sur nous et je pense que ça devient un peu compliqué. Moi, je suis assez attachée aux libertés individuelles, donc je ne vous cache pas qu'à un moment donné, je trouve un peu compliqué, mais on avancera avec le sujet. Messieurs, je vous remercie pour votre présence. Thank you very much for being here during all this time. Et je donne rendez-vous à nos membres, à nos sponsors et à toutes celles et ceux qui nous ont suivis ce soir. Ce sera le prochain 5 à 7, le 22 juin, sur un tout autre sujet, puisque là, nous partirons dans le domaine des cryptographies. On passera vraiment à autre chose, mais on vous donne rendez-vous bientôt, le 22 juin, même heure, même lieu. Bonne soirée à tous et prenez soin de vous. Il y aura les terrasses à ce moment-là. Il y aura les terrasses. Allez, bye bye. Thank you very much indeed. See you next time. Bye.
Bye bye. Merci.
Bye bye.